Imentet, meaning she of the west, was a goddess in ancient Egyptian religion representing the necropolises west of the Nile. She was the consort of Akon, a god who guided Ra through parts of the underworld. Although she was never officially worshipped, she was mentioned in various hymns and passages of the Book of the Dead. Her title, She of the West, is not just a statement related to geography, but also related as her role in mythology because, as the sun sets towards the west, it was to be accompanied by death, which was where Amentet usually reigned. Additionally, Amenti or Amentet was thought to be where the sun set, and where the entrance to the underworld was located, although later the term began to associate itself with graveyards and tombs as well. As goddess of the deceased, she lived in a tree looking out at the entrance to the Duat, underworld. Her main job, other than being a minor fertility goddess, was to offer food and drink to the newly dead, which would restore their spirits enough to travel to the field of reeds, which is often equated with paradise in ancient Egyptian religion by modern authors. However, she was so closely linked with Hathor and Isis in their afterlife roles that she may be less an independent deity than an alternate form of those two goddesses. Imentet greeting Pharaoh Horemheb in his tomb. She was usually depicted in a red sheath dress wearing the hieroglyph for west on her head and a scepter and an ankh in her hands. She often appears in tombs welcoming the deceased into the afterlife, sometimes with wings, and sometimes as a kite because of her connection to Isis and Nephthys. Imhotep, ancient Egyptian, comes in peace, late 27th century BC, was an Egyptian chancellor to the pharaoh Djoser, possible architect of Djoser's step pyramid, and high priest of the sun god Ra at Heliopolis. Very little is known of Imhotep as a historical figure, but in the 3,000 years following his death, he was gradually glorified and deified. Traditions from long after Imhotep's death treated him as a great author of wisdom texts and especially as a physician. No text from his lifetime mentions these capacities, and no text mentions his name in the first 1,200 years following his death. Apart from the 3 short contemporary inscriptions that establish him as chancellor to the pharaoh, the first text to reference Imhotep dates to the time of Amenhotep III 1391 to 1353 BCE. It is addressed to the owner of a tomb, and reads, "The Wab priest may give offerings to your ka. The Wab priests may stretch to you their arms with libations on the soil, as it is done for Imhotep with the remains of the water bowl." It appears that this libation to Imhotep was done regularly, as they are attested on papyri associated with statues of Imhotep until the late period 664 to 332 BCE. Explains the origin of this cult as a slow evolution of intellectuals' memory of Imhotep, from his death onward. Gardiner finds the cult of Imhotep during the New Kingdom 1550 to 1077 BCE sufficiently distinct from the usual offerings made to other commoners that the epithet demigod is likely justified to describe his veneration. The first references to the healing abilities of Imhotep occur from the 30th dynasty 380 to 343 BCE onward, some 2,200 years after his death. Imhotep is among the few non-royal Egyptians who were deified after their deaths, and until the 21st century, he was one of nearly a dozen non-royals to achieve this status. The center of his cult was in Memphis. The location of his tomb remains unknown, despite efforts to find it. The consensus is that it is hidden somewhere at Saqqara. Imhotep's historicity is confirmed by 2 contemporary inscriptions made during his lifetime on the base or pedestal of one of Djoser's statues, Cairo JE 49889, and also by a graffito on the enclosure wall surrounding Sekhemket's unfinished step pyramid. The latter inscription suggests that Imhotep outlived Djoser by a few years and went on to serve in the construction of Pharaoh Sekhemket's pyramid, which was abandoned due to this ruler's brief reign. Imhotep was one of the chief officials of the pharaoh Djoser. Concurring with much later legends, Egyptologists credit him with the design and construction of the Pyramid of Djoser, a step pyramid at Saqqara built during the 3rd dynasty. He may also have been responsible for the first known use of stone columns to support a building. Despite these later attestations, the pharaonic Egyptians themselves never credited Imhotep as the designer of the stepped pyramid, nor with the invention of stone architecture. The Upper Egyptian famine stela, which dates from the Ptolemaic period, 305 to 30 BCE, bears an inscription containing a legend about a famine lasting 7 years during the reign of Djoser. Imhotep is credited with having been instrumental in ending it. A Demotic papyrus from the Temple of Tebtunis, dating to the 2nd century CE, preserves a long story about Imhotep. The pharaoh Djoser plays a prominent role in the story, which also mentions Imhotep's family, his father the god Ptah, his mother Kerduenk, and his younger sister Rinpenfret. At one point Djoser desires Rinpenfret, and Imhotep disguises himself and tries to rescue her. The text also refers to the royal tomb of Djoser. Part of the legend includes an anachronistic battle between the Old Kingdom and the Assyrian armies where Imhotep fights an Assyrian sorceress in a duel of magic. As an instigator of Egyptian culture, Imhotep's idealized image lasted well into the Roman period. In the Ptolemaic period, the Egyptian priest and historian Manetho credited him with inventing the method of a stone-dressed building during Djoser's reign, though he was not the first to actually build with stone. Stone walling, flooring, lintels, and jambs had appeared sporadically during the Archaic period, though it is true that a building of the size of the step pyramid made entirely out of stone had never before been constructed. Before Djoser, pharaohs were buried in mastaba tombs. Isis was a major goddess in ancient Egyptian religion whose worship spread throughout the Greco-Roman world. Isis was first mentioned in the Old Kingdom, circa 2686, circa 2181 BCE, as one of the main characters of the Osiris myth, in which she resurrects her slain brother and husband, the divine king Osiris, and produces and protects his heir, Horus. She was believed to help the dead enter the afterlife as she had helped Osiris, and she was considered the divine mother of the pharaoh, who was likened to Horus. Her maternal aid was invoked in healing spells to benefit ordinary people. Originally, she played a limited role in royal rituals and temple rites, although she was more prominent in funerary practices and magical texts. She was usually portrayed in art as a human woman wearing a throne-like hieroglyph on her head. During the New Kingdom, circa 1550, circa 1070 BCE, as she took on traits that originally belonged to Hathor, the preeminent goddess of earlier times, Isis was portrayed wearing Hathor's headdress, a sun disk between the horns of a cow. In the first millennium BCE, Osiris and Isis became the most widely worshipped Egyptian deities, and Isis absorbed traits from many other goddesses. Rulers in Egypt and its neighbor to the south, Nubia, built temples dedicated primarily to Isis, and her temple at Philae was a religious center for Egyptians and Nubians alike. Her reputed magical power was greater than that of all other gods, and she was said to protect the kingdom from its enemies, govern the skies and the natural world, and have power over fate itself. In the Hellenistic period, 323 to 30 BCE, when Egypt was ruled and settled by Greeks, Isis was worshipped by Greeks and Egyptians, along with a new god, Serapis. Their worship diffused into the wider Mediterranean world. Isis's Greek devotees ascribed to her traits taken from Greek deities, such as the invention of marriage and the protection of ships at sea, and she retained strong links with Egypt and other Egyptian deities who were popular in the Hellenistic world, such as Osiris and Harpocrates. As Hellenistic culture was absorbed by Rome in the 1st century BCE, the cult of Isis became a part of Roman religion. Her devotees were a small proportion of the Roman Empire's population, but were found all across its territory. Her following developed distinctive festivals such as the Navigium Isidis, as well as initiation ceremonies resembling those of other Greco-Roman mystery cults. Some of her devotees said she encompassed all feminine divine powers in the world. The worship of Isis was ended by the rise of Christianity in the 4th through 6th centuries CE. Her worship may have influenced Christian beliefs and practices such as the veneration of Mary, but the evidence for this influence is ambiguous and often controversial. Isis continues to appear in Western culture, particularly in esotericism and modern paganism, often as a personification of nature or the feminine aspect of divinity. Despite her significance in the Osiris myth, Isis was originally a minor deity in the ideology surrounding the living king. She played only a small role, for instance, in the dramatic Ramesseum papyrus, the script for royal rituals performed in the reign of Senusret I in the Middle Kingdom. Her importance grew during the New Kingdom, when she was increasingly connected with Hathor and the human queen. The early 1st millennium BC saw an increased emphasis on the family triad of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, and an explosive growth in Isis's popularity. In the 4th century BCE, Nectaneboi of the 30th dynasty claimed Isis as his patron deity, tying her still more closely to political power. The kingdom of Kush, which ruled Nubia from the 8th century BCE to the 4th century CE, absorbed and adapted the Egyptian ideology surrounding kingship. It equated Isis with the Candake, the queen or queen mother of the Kushite king. The Ptolemaic Greek kings, who ruled Egypt as pharaohs from 305 to 30 BCE, developed an ideology that linked them with both Egyptian and Greek deities, to strengthen their claim to the throne in the eyes of their Greek and Egyptian subjects. For centuries before, Greek colonists and visitors to Egypt had drawn parallels between Egyptian deities and their own, in a process known as Interpretatio Graeca. Herodotus, a Greek who wrote about Egypt in the 5th century BCE, likened Isis to Demeter, whose mythical search for her daughter Persephone resembled Isis's search for Osiris. Demeter was one of the few Greek deities to be widely adopted by Egyptians in Ptolemaic times, so the similarity between her and Isis provided a link between the two cultures. 92. In other cases, Isis was linked with Aphrodite through the sexual aspects of her character. Building on these traditions, the first two Ptolemies promoted the cult of the new god Serapis, who combined aspects of Osiris and Apis with those of Greek gods such as Zeus and Dionysus. Isis, portrayed in a Hellenized form, was regarded as the consort of Serapis as well as of Osiris. Ptolemy II and his sister and wife Arsinoe II developed a ruler cult around themselves, so that they were worshipped in the same temples as Serapis and Isis, and Arsinoe was likened to both Isis and Aphrodite. Some later Ptolemaic queens identified themselves still more closely with Isis. Cleopatra III, in the 2nd century BCE, used Isis's name in place of her own in inscriptions, and Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of Egypt before it was annexed by Rome, used the epithet the new Isis. Images of Isis made outside Egypt were Hellenistic in style, like many of the images of her made in Egypt in Hellenistic and Roman times. The attributes she bore varied widely. She sometimes wore the Hathoric cowhorn headdress, but Greeks and Romans reduced its size and often interpreted it as a crescent moon. She could also wear headdresses incorporating leaves, flowers, or ears of grain. Other common traits included corkscrew locks of hair and an elaborate mantle tied in a large knot over the breasts, which originated in ordinary Egyptian clothing but was treated as a symbol of the goddess outside Egypt. In her hands she could carry a uraeus or a sistrum, both taken from her Egyptian iconography, or a situla, a vessel used for libations of water or milk that were performed in Isis's cult. As Isis Fortuna or Isis Tyche, she held a rudder, representing control of fate, in her right hand and a cornucopia, standing for abundance, in her left. As Isis Feria she wore a cloak that billowed behind her like a sail, and as Isis Lactans, she nursed Harpocrates. At times she was shown resting afoot on a celestial sphere, representing her control of the cosmos. The diverse imagery sprang from her varied roles. Elaborating upon Isis's role as a wife and mother in the Osiris myth, Erytologies call her the inventor of marriage and parenthood. She was invoked to protect women in childbirth and, in ancient Greek novels such as the Ephesian Tale, to protect their virginity. Some ancient texts called her the patroness of women in general. Her cult may have served to promote women's autonomy in a limited way, with Isis's power and authority serving as a precedent, but in myth she was devoted to, and never fully independent of, her husband and son. The Erytologies show ambiguous attitudes toward women's independence. One says Isis made women equal to men, whereas another says she made women subordinate to their husbands. Isis was often characterized as a moon goddess, paralleling the solar characteristics of Serapis. she was also seen as a cosmic goddess more generally. Various texts claim she organized the behavior of the sun, moon, and stars, governing time and the seasons which, in turn, guaranteed the fertility of the earth. These texts also credit her with inventing agriculture, establishing laws, and devising or promoting other elements of human society. This idea derives from older Greek traditions about the role of various Greek deities and culture heroes, including Demeter, in establishing civilization. In many spells in the pyramid texts, Isis and Nephthys help the deceased king reach the afterlife. In the coffin texts from the Middle Kingdom, Isis appears still more frequently, though in these texts Osiris is credited with reviving the dead more often than she is. New Kingdom sources such as the Book of the Dead describe Isis as protecting deceased souls as they face the dangers in the duat. They also describe Isis as a member of the divine councils that judge souls' moral righteousness before admitting them into the afterlife, and she appears in vignettes standing beside Osiris as he presides over this tribunal. Isis and Nephthys took part in funeral ceremonies, where two wailing women, much like those in the festival at Abydos, mourned the deceased as the two goddesses mourned Osiris. Isis was frequently shown or alluded to in funerary equipment, on sarcophagi and canopic chests as one of the four goddesses who protected the four sons of Horus, in tomb art offering her enlivening milk to the dead, and in the Tayid amulets that were often placed on mummies to ensure that Isis's power would shield them from harm. Late funerary texts prominently featured her mourning for Osiris, and one such text, one of the Books of Breathing, was said to have been written by her for Osiris's benefit. In Nubian funerary religion, Isis was regarded as more significant than her husband, because she was the active partner while he only passively received the offerings she made to sustain him in the afterlife. Many of the roles Isis acquired gave her an important position in the sky. Passages in the pyramid texts connect Isis closely with Sopdet, the goddess representing the star Sirius, whose relationship with her husband Sa, the constellation Orion, and their son Sopdu parallels Isis's relations with Osiris and Horus. Sirius's heliacal rising, just before the start of the Nile flood, gave Sopdet a close connection with the flood and the resulting growth of plants. Partly because of her relationship with Sopdet, Isis was also linked with the flood, which was sometimes equated with the tears she shed for Osiris. By Ptolemaic times she was connected with rain, which Egyptian texts call a Nile in the sky, with the sun as the protector of Rosbark, and with the moon, possibly because she was linked with the Greek lunar goddess Artemis by a shared connection with an Egyptian fertility goddess, Batet. In hymns inscribed at Philae she is called the Lady of Heaven, whose dominion over the sky parallels Osiris's rule over the duat and Horus's kingship on earth.